Thursday. Okay, everyone. So we are up to 40, and we're going to go ahead and let Ranger Shelton get going right away. And let me just give those of you who have already heard this spiel while we were kind of background planning in the front here with you who are on, we're going to do a little modification and let Ranger Shelton give us a little bit of his experience, and then we're going to move straight into some question and answers. He has been generous enough to be flexible with us and shoot for going about until, so we'll start our next session about 10 minutes late. So that's how we'll roll with that one. So we have a good 40 minutes here, and we'll just try to soak it all in. And I do want to say, Amanda from Yellowstone, do you want to give us your abridged version of what you were going to say earlier before to introduce Ranger Shelton?
Whatever works. I certainly can. Yeah. So I have to, first of all, good morning from Gardner. I'm a MEEA board member, and I have to admit I'm incredibly nervous, and I'm having really big pinch me moments because Ranger Shelton Johnson is a personal hero and celebrity to me and has been for over a decade. So I'm ecstatic that I get to introduce him. I was first introduced to him, and probably like many of you, via the Ken Burns, the National Parks America's Best Idea documentary. Since then, he's been featured on things like The Oprah Show. He is a national park ranger in Yosemite National Park. He's notably known for resurrecting the stories of the Buffalo Soldiers. And if you ever get the chance, go down that YouTube rabbit hole. It is so worth watching all those programs on YouTube. He is an award winner. He's won the Freeman Tilden Award, an author, and as mentioned, currently a park ranger in Yosemite. So he's a perfect way to kick off our conference as we explore equity and inclusion, as he has done a lot of work himself with equity and inclusion in places like parks and open spaces. So it is my extreme honor to be able to introduce Ranger Shelton Johnson.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say that that was a very gracious introduction, particularly since it's coming from someone who is in Montana. My experience as a park ranger ranges from Yellowstone National Park, where I began as a ranger in 1987, and then I spent about 1.5 years in Washington, D.C. I was actually in Washington, D.C., I was interpreting the influence of the Industrial Revolution on agriculture, which is a fancy way of saying I was a farmer. And I worked at a farm, and I drove a tractor and slopped the pigs and milked the cows and tried never to get those two things mixed up. And then besides that area, from there, I went to Great Basin National Park in Nevada, Nevada's only national park, and spent a great deal of time in an underground world. I conducted tours of Lehman Cave, a limestone solution cavern, and that was my first, or my second or third entry into literally another world. So if you've never been to Great Basin, I would definitely recommend going, because it has some of the darkest night skies anywhere in the world. So you can see the Milky Way split the sky in two hemispheres on a moonless night. And it's an absolute, there's so many stars. I remember a kid saying, "Hey, Mom, I can't find the Big Dipper. Could somebody get these stars out of the way?" And it was just astonishing to hear that. So, and I think that's important because having the night sky, having that experience of looking up and seeing infinity all around you is part of the human experience for much of our existence on this planet. And I think that the loss of that connection with the eternal, that loss of connection with the night sky, is also the beginning of our lost connection with the earth itself. And that's the one last thing, even in an urban area where you have the chance to reconnect with something that is infinite, is if you can somehow see the stars. And last few years I've been working with Ken Burns and the Ken Burns American Heritage Prize. I've been in Manhattan, and one thing you cannot see very clearly in Manhattan at night are the stars. And this is really important to me, because my first immersion into the night sky was probably when I was in the Peace Corps. I was a 7th grade English teacher in Liberia, West Africa. And I remember arriving at my village, which was called Karlake, and it was late at night. And I remember taking a shower, and it was this outside sort of shelter with there was no roof. And I couldn't recognize the constellations that I was used to. It was a completely different night sky because it was so close to the equator. And it was really one of those transcendent experiences. I mean, I felt like I wasn't just washing myself clean. I was opening myself up to that which was above me, that which was around me, that which surrounds the earth itself. You know, eternity. I keep going back to that word because the eternal is something that I think of when I think of the earth, which of course is nowhere near that. But when you look at the night sky, you're looking back into time, and you're looking at light, ancient light that left those stellar objects literally millions and millions of years ago. So who knows if the stars are really even still there, because that light is so far away. So, you know, when you have experiences like that, they kind of stick with you. And being in Africa, being in that wild place, I was in the rainforest, that stays with you as well. And it's the first environment that I've been in that I felt that the environment itself was as alive as I was. I don't know if any of you folks have ever been in the tropics, but you know, it's like you're in a petri dish. I mean, everything you touch, everything you feel, everything you breathe around you has its own life, and to some degree may have its own consciousness as well. That's kind of how I lean is towards that sense of every living thing being possessed of spirit and having spirit. And I felt that when I was in Africa. It's the wildest environment that I've been in, and I've been in quite a few wild environments. I lived in Montana, you know, for 6 or 7 years. I worked for the concession there. I also worked, my first job as a park ranger was in Gardner, Montana. And I loved working in Yellowstone. I was there in '88 when we had the great fires. I worked the North Fork fire and the Fan fire, and had the privilege of actually experiencing an entire ecosystem rekindling itself, reinventing itself, resparking itself, if you will. And that was just absolutely an amazing experience. I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I'm glad I had that experience. And what I found in these what I call these immersions into the wild, I'm grateful everything that has happened to me, but it would not have happened. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now if I hadn't been the son of a military, a veteran. My father was from Spartanburg, South Carolina. He served in the Army and the Air Force. He served in Berlin right after World War II, and then in the infantry in Korea. Then he was in the Air Force in Vietnam. Well, we lived with him when he was in Germany, and when he was in England. So I was 5 years old in Germany. We lived in the Saarland, in a little village called Kontwisch, in a bigger town called Zweibrücken. And that was my first immersion into the mountains. There was a family trip to Berchtesgaden, and Berchtesgaden is now a sister park to Yosemite. And I'm actually in conversation with folks from Berchtesgaden right now because I have another event for Earth Day that's involving the American Embassy in Berlin. But anyway, so I'm looking forward to that too. But what I'm saying is that when I was in Germany and 5 years of age, there was a family trip to the Bavarian Alps. And it's like one of those John Muir type moments, one of those transcendent moments when you are literally on top of a mountain and you can see the clouds beneath your feet, and you can see the shadows of those clouds, you know, just drifting across the earth. And I felt suspended between heaven and earth. And the only thing that was keeping me bound to this world were the hands of my father and the hands of my mom. And both of them have since passed away. Actually, my nuclear family and my brother as well, they've all passed away. But in my memory, they're still there, and I can still feel the hands of my parents in mine when I was 5 years old, as we stood there on a precipice, you know, suspended between heaven and earth. And I've never lost that. And that was my initial immersion into the wild, was the mountains. And I don't want to kind of wax into the sacred, but why not? What good is the sacred if you don't wax into it, you know? But I mean sacred in a non-denominational sense. I mean, in terms of what it means to be a primate, what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a mammal, what it means to have eyes that you can see with, ears that you can listen, and hands that you can touch and that you can feel and be felt by the world itself. It was that kind of introduction embrace. When you're 5 years old, you don't have that adult faculty to filter out the things that you don't want to absorb. You just take everything in. That's why children are so wonderful, because they're open to the universe. And we unlearn that as we get older. And I think part of the experience of being in the wild is that reawakening of that childlike wonder. And when kids don't have that experience, their expectations tend to be lower. And I believe that their horizons tend to be more circumspect. They tend to be narrower. So I think that to have that childhood experience in the wild is a right. It shouldn't be a privilege. It should be actually a right. And there's too many young people, especially children of color, who don't have that experience of literally being enveloped and being immersed in nature. And I mean wild nature. They don't have that experience. They don't know what that's like. And in particular, those people tend to be my own people. African Americans in particular are the one group least likely to have these wilderness experiences. So the only reason why we're having this conversation is primarily because I had that immersion in the wild when I was 5 years old, when I lived with my parents in Germany. And that's why we're having this conversation, because something woke up in me and it's never gone to sleep. And it's that connection to the earth itself. And so getting into, the subject matter of wilderness itself, I think I need to, clarify by giving you a sense of my orientation. Even though I was raised as an African American in the inner city of Detroit in the 1960s, and I say that because what I'm also indicating to you is the incredible unlikeliness of me ever becoming a national park ranger. The inner city Detroit compared to Yellowstone is on a different planet. And the only reason why this conversation that we're having it, is primarily because I had those memories of being with my parents on that mountaintop, in Bavaria. And I never forgot those memories. It just, something grabbed hold of me, and it has never let go. And it's always with me. And as a result, I just always had this predilection to wilderness. And I should start off by saying that I have a different perception of wilderness. I am not particularly fond of that word. Words are my craft to some degree. I was in a master's program in poetry at the University of Michigan. My bachelor's degree is in English Lit. I was trained as a classical musician, played jazz as well, but that's my background. My background is from the arts. It's rooted in the arts. It's rooted in music, poetry, and literature. And so when I was a kid, and everything gets rooted back to that period of wonder, if I had not had that experience of being open to the world around me in Bavaria on that mountaintop in the Alps, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's why I am so bent and so passionate about getting kids of color into wilderness areas, into national parks, because it's a transformative experience. And you folks know that. I mean, I'm not just preaching to the choir. I mean, you're giving the sermon that I'm giving back, And so I want all kids to have that connection. And it's also, I don't want these sacred spaces. And I think of national parks, not just in the United States, but around the world, as being sacred spaces. I want all kids to have that immersion, or that immersive experience that I had, when you're most open to it. And that's the problem with being an adult. Most adults have that faculty where they can screen out the things they don't want to listen to, screen out the things they don't want to see, screen out the things they don't want to hear. I think we're experiencing that in our culture right now. That's as far as I'll go in that direction. But I think there's a lot of screening out. And the problem with that is you're screening out the good with the bad. And you have to be very circumspect and careful and deliberate and spiritually attuned enough to realize that, or be careful that you don't screen out something that you really need to hear. And sometimes something can be bitter and hard to swallow. But the thing I always like to communicate, many of the medicines that our civilization has created are bitter and hard to swallow, but they're medicinal, and they will help you. With the thing that I love about wilderness, it's not hard to swallow. There is no bitterness. There's just this sweetness to it. But actually, at the same time, I know from being in Yellowstone, there's a foulness too. I mean, if you're, when I was in Yellowstone after the fires in '88, and you're walking around and you can, smell the animals that had been, occasionally burned by the fire, and you knew there was something dead around you. And it was disturbing, because in grizzly bear habitat, when you smell something dead, that brings in predators. And so you're just looking over your shoulder and you're looking down the trail to see what might be there. And I never had one of those particular types of encounters, but I'm just saying that to a great degree, we are predisposed to perceive nature in a specific way. And that's really what I'm trying to get to with you folks, is that my whole orientation with wilderness, with the word wilderness, I find that it often has a disassociative function, meaning it tends to push people away by putting people outside of that dynamic. And from an indigenous point of view, there is no such word as wilderness. I mean, and I'll say that again, I have not encountered any indigenous nation, people, or culture anywhere in the world that I'm familiar with that has a corresponding term to describe wilderness. Because when you look at the Wilderness Act and you read the Wilderness Act, which I'm certain you folks have, probably know it by heart, this whole thing of human beings being separate from the land, the places that we have never touched, that goes against human history and the evolution of us as a species. We anything that we can touch, we can, and what we can touch, we will hold. And that's why we have the opposable thumb to grip and hold and make tools out of things that were not necessarily perceived by other organisms as being a tool. The whole idea of having tools is not unique to us. Ravens use tools, other organisms use tools, but it's just that what we've done with those tools and what we've created with those tools, and the positives and the negatives as well. So my perception is, which again is indigenous, and as indigenous, I should clarify what I mean by that. My maternal grandparents are Black Indians from Oklahoma. My grandfather was born and raised in a small farm town called Inola. And Inola is a Cherokee word. And this was an Indian territory when Oklahoma was not yet a state. My grandmother is from McAllister, Oklahoma. And McAllister is the second largest town in the Choctaw Nation in Indian country. So my maternal grandparents are Black Indians. And then my father's side of the family, it's African and Seminole. So I am African, Seminole, Cherokee, and Irish. And the Irish are also indigenous people to Ireland. So those are all my bloodlines. And so when I think about that, and I look at and read the Wilderness Act, and I see this pushback of human beings not being present in the landscape, that's just a hard thing for indigenous people to swallow when all they know is the world that is around them. And I think that what's important about that is that there are still human beings on this earth that never left Eden. Now, when I say Eden, that exists within the Judeo-Christian context, but what I mean is they've never left that sacred space. That's really kind of what I mean by Eden, not necessarily specifically Christianity, but the whole notion that the earth itself, the wildness of the earth itself, occupies a sacred space, both within the mind, within the heart, and within the spirit. The whole notion of an ancestral homeland, that where there is no separation between the people and the place beneath their feet and the land beneath their feet. So when people ask me about the whole idea, of wilderness, and the whole idea of how people have, with increasing urbanization, which has really happened since the Industrial Revolution, we've been pushing ourselves away from the earth. And I think that the Wilderness Act, what it does do and what it does do well, it recognizes the importance of reestablishing those connections. But, when you're in the Peace Corps, as I was for a very short period of time, I remember that some of my students, most of them were bilingual or trilingual, and they often couldn't tell me the name of a bird or a plant in English, which is the official language in Liberia, West Africa, but they could tell me the name of some of the birds and plants around me in their indigenous language. And that indigenous language, that sacred language, tied them to the ground beneath their feet and tied them to the sky above their heads. And I think that that's one thing that kids need to have, that experience of being bound between heaven and earth, such as I had, when I was a kid in Germany. And having national parks allows children to reestablish those connections. And, I have to say to you, when you grow up in an urban area like Detroit, in the inner city, the likelihood of me ever becoming a national park ranger was incredibly remote. I can't think of another environment that is so far removed from a Yellowstone or from Great Basin National Park in terms of the night skies that are visible there. But again, I had that seed planted in me when my family lived in Germany. And that's, again, why we're having this conversation. And that's why I'm so enamored of the whole idea of a wild earth, a wild planet, and to communicate that separating ourselves from that is separating ourselves from our own humanity. And if we want to maintain what it means to be a human being, we have to maintain what it means to be a primate that is bound to the earth with feet that are bound to the earth. So when I think about the Greek myths, I always think about the myth of Antaeus. Antaeus was this wrestler, and as long as his feet touched the earth, he could never be defeated. And then Hercules, or Heracles in the Greek versus the Roman. I'm sorry, but I'm into this stuff. I probably should seek therapy, but it's just really fascinating. Heracles, he beat Antaeus by literally wrenching him from the ground, so his feet no longer had contact with the earth, the sacred earth, which gave him his strength. And then he held him above his head and strangled him in midair. And I don't know why we don't use that myth to speak to what is happening to human beings today, especially in the West, because the myth of Antaeus really speaks to that. Because for us, it would be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is that act, that activity, that movement towards the machineries that have allowed us to further separate ourselves from Mother Earth. And that's the problem. That's the problem. We have lost that sense of the sacred. And when you lose that sense of the sacred and you start looking at the earth itself as a commodity, you start looking at the earth itself as something to utilize, as mountains are good for ore, and timber just becomes bored feet. Rivers become the potential for hydroelectric dams. That's a reductionist perception that removes the sacred from the natural world. And with the removal of the sacred from the natural world, you have the acquisition of the natural world, the utilization of the natural world as a commodity for our civilization, which I believe is an ironic term when you consider that what we're doing to the earth, we're doing to ourselves. So what I'm actually always arguing is that we need to reestablish that sacred connection to the earth, and we need to model ourselves in terms of that relationship by looking at and communicating with the indigenous people. And we need to stop looking at indigenous people living in remote parts of the world as somehow being less, because our whole mindset is based on advancement linked to technology. And I don't think that technology is necessarily means you're advanced. You're advanced within a certain narrow pathway. But these cultures have an incredibly rich, complex relationship with each other and also with the world around them. And they're fluent in a language that we no longer speak. And I think that we need to start speaking that language and hold on to that language, because that is what will keep us from not destroying the earth. The earth will live on, but by destroying ourselves due to that lack of connection. And that's why I mentioned Antaeus. Everything that we've done since the Industrial Revolution speaks to the commodification of the earth, the sense that the earth itself is literally a commodity to be bought and spent, as opposed to something sacred. It is a temple, it is a mosque, it is a cathedral, but it's a cathedral that we live in. It's not just a place for the infinite, for the gods above. It is a place for all of us and our families and our children and our grandchildren to inhabit. And the earth wasn't broken before we started doing what we're doing. The earth was fine and it was doing fine. And we just need to restore that balance first within us before we can restore the balance with the earth itself. So it's not that the earth that needs to be fixed, it's human beings. We need to be fixed, and we need to reconnect ourselves to something sacred. And I use these words intentionally. And when you listen to elders from different indigenous nations around the world, there's always that sense of the sacred when they talk about their connection to Mother Earth. And I think that we have lost that, and that's what the Industrial Revolution did, in that severance from the earth itself and the commodification of it, turning it into just something to be used. And that part of the wilderness notion, it speaks to me, because there is that sense of the sacred that you can, when you listen to people, going all the way back to the Transcendentalists, to Emerson and Thoreau, and of course Emerson influenced John Muir, and there's all those folks. But I'm looking more at the connection that indigenous people have, as opposed to the period of Romanticism, which was really the movement in the 19th century that really began human beings to reconnect, at least in the Western civilization trajectory, to reconnect with the earth. And I put it this way: the indigenous people, they never left Eden. They're still there. They still have that sacred connection to eternity, to the infinite, to that which is greater than all of us. And the restoration of that is literally what we need to be doing. And for me, it's these inner city kids who are African American, who descend from indigenous people from the west coast of Africa and farther inland as well, and who now are the one group least likely to have a wilderness experience, least likely to go to a national park. And that is so complex, those barriers that are now internalized barriers, not external barriers. African Americans come from a history of externalized barriers because of race, going all the way back to obviously to slavery. But now what's keeping us out of these spaces is internal. It's these internalized barriers of a trauma, this multi-generational, intergenerational trauma that has been with us with regard to slavery. And that's why I'm more attuned to these stories and this legacy, because, as I said, I'm a Black Indian, I'm African, I'm Cherokee, I'm Seminole and Irish. So I can claim bloodlines or a bloodline connection to the Middle Passage, the slave ships, the coffin ships, the Indian Wars, the genocide of Native people. It's all in my blood. And so and I feel perfectly balanced. I feel okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't live with anger. I live with this sense of how blessed a life I've had to be able to spend my life in Yellowstone and Yosemite and Great Basin. I just want other people, other Americans and other people around the world to have that same sort of sense of the sacred. And I know you know what I'm talking about. I know that you've read the Wilderness Act and you know about Bob Marshall and you know the talk, but I know that when you are out there, there's a nonverbal communication at the cellular level between yourself and the world around you. And you don't need an interpreter at that point to communicate that there is something that is much more ancient than ourselves and much more powerful than ourselves and much more sentient than ourselves that's around us. So it makes me think of, like, how trees, plants communicate with each other, and then conifers, how they have those roots in the mycorrhizae that connect not just with the soil, but they connect with plants, other plants that are in the soil. They connect with their own seedlings. It's like, oh, you're mine. Oh, you're mine. No, you're not mine. You're behind that one over there, that tree. You're not mine. I mean, I just love the conversations that are happening in terms of chemistry and in terms of energy in the world around us that we are not privy to. And so if you add all that up, everything is connected. And we need to just make certain that we're back in that mode of recognizing and feeling those connections. Because really what I'm talking about is not an intellectual pursuit. What I'm talking about is restoring this spiritual, physical, biological connection to something that is transcendent, that transcends being human, but it does not transcend being of this earth. And that's what we need to restore. So that's why, I have issues with John Muir, but John Muir probably would have issues with me. But my sense is that that seeing that sense of the sacred is something that we need to adhere to, not in a non-dogmatic manner, but we need to be like our ancestors and restore that sense of reverence, if you will, with regard to not just the earth, but everything else that's out there in the universe. And walking into a space with reverence, with a sense of the sacred, that communicates. And it's hard to get into an argument with someone when they walk into the room with that sense of reverence. I remember reading a story about the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was at a hotel and he was staying there. Some sort of conference was coming on, and he would just walk down the hallway. And the people that were there, that worked there, did not know who he was. They knew nothing about him. But all they knew was when he walked into that space, they felt better. They felt more relaxed. They felt connected to something, and they didn't know who he was, but there was this energy coming from him that made them all just feel good, made them all feel rooted, made them all feel connected. And they had no idea who this person was. All they knew was they were in the presence of something or someone that was in the presence of something that was much greater than all of them. And they could feel that. They could feel that energy. And the thing is, that energy is there for all of us to connect with. You don't have to be the Dalai Lama. You just have to be someone who is open to that, and you will feel it, and it will become part of who you are. And everyone listening to me, you know that, you're aware of that, because you felt that when you've been on top of a mountain, when you've been in the shadow of a cliff, when you've been in a forest of coniferous trees or deciduous trees, or you walk through an alpine meadow in the springtime. You felt that. This is a nonverbal kind of communication. But if if everyone doesn't have it, then what good is it? Everyone needs to have that experience. And whenever you run up against those people who just don't get it, show me your hands if you run it up to people who just don't get it. They don't get it because they have forgotten it and they're resistant to that kind of communication. So that's what's valuable. That's the great value in what you're doing. You're introducing that experience to people, but don't fool yourself. It's not just an intellectual thing. It is a spiritual thing. It is a psychological thing. It's all of that blended together. And that's what makes it so profound. And I think that people are hungry for something that they've never tasted. They're thirsty for something that it never passed their lips before. They need something, but they have no name for it. And sometimes, when you're in Yosemite Valley, you can see it, you can feel it. You can just look at people's faces, and there's this light in their face, and there's this look of awe when they're looking up at Half Dome or El Capitan, or they're in the Mariposa Grove, and they're looking up at the general. All these giant sequoias named after generals. That's a whole other story right there. But they're looking at the grizzly giant, and which is the most famous giant sequoia in the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoia. And they're just in awe of what they're seeing. And the root of the word awe also has this element of fear to it. But one thing that's great about fear, and if all of you folks that have been in the wilderness, you have experienced fear. Fear is a great mechanism for an awakening. When you are fearful, your eyes are open. When you are fearful, you're listening like you've never listened before. Your heart is racing. It's like this, flight or fight instinct kicks in. I think that the presence of a grizzly bear is the presence of a spiritual teacher. As long as you don't get mauled, it's a great teacher. Because when you are in the presence of a grizzly bear, which I had several encounters, I was thinking maybe they've never seen a black guy before. I don't know what it is, but they're always around me, But I had several encounters with grizzly bears when I was in Yellowstone. And I surprised a mother bear, a sow with 2 cubs, less than 20 feet away, which is really close to a mother bear and 2 cubs. And the cubs were at least yearlings. They were very large. They didn't strike me as cubs. And I remember this time just slowed down. And it was like that bullet time in the Matrix. Everything just went, like that. And the mother bear stood up and she was looking at me, and I just couldn't speak. And the person that I was hiking with, she just walked right into me because I just stopped right in my tracks. And I'm just holding my hand out like that, pointing at her, and she's looking at me, and our eyes locked. And she was just thinking, and I could tell that she was thinking. There was a deliberation going on, and it was really key and very pure and simplistic, very direct. The deliberation was, kill them, let them live. Kill them, let them live. What should I do? What should I do? And luckily for me and my friend, her cubs made the choice. They kept running, and they were running right across the trail in front of us. And the cubs kept running. So the mother bear, she stood up, and grizzly bears are somewhat short-sighted. They're not they got to get closer to see what is that right there. And so she basically just went back down on all fours and stayed with their cubs. So the cubs saved our lives. And I've talked to a couple of bear biologists and says, oh, you probably would have been okay. If you might not have been as big a threat as you think. People have been, and I'm thinking 20 feet from a mother bear with 2 cubs. Surprising that's like the worst case scenario. I mean, I know the worst case scenario for running into grizzly bears, because you look into that when you're living in Yellowstone National Park. But she made the choice that they are not a threat. I'll just move away. Why can't we make the same choice with regard to the world? It's not a threat. Why subdue it? Why use it? Why not just be in it? And so what I found is that everything in nature has the capacity to be a teacher, and every experience in nature has the capacity to be a lesson plan, to be a book, to be a treatise, to be a dissertation. And she gave me the dissertation on why an apex predator can have the generosity of spirit to allow food to go on its way, because I have a higher priority now, and that's to make certain that my children are safe. And that's what I felt was the background of that whole kind of exchange. But at that point, I mean, I wasn't thinking in terms of what I'm saying to you right now because I was in a state of shock. But a state of shock is also a state of awareness. It's kind of like an electrical charge that bumps you out of whatever mindset that you're in and brings you and grounds you and roots you into the reality of that moment. And we live our lives so in such a distracted way that we're not fully present. And it is very difficult to not be present when you're in the presence of a grizzly bear, when you're in the presence of a mountain lion, when you're in the presence of an apex predator. There's no greater spiritual awakening than the idea and the reality that your life may end in a few seconds. And it's a frightening thought to consider that some people aren't fully awake until they are actually near death, or feeling like they're about to die. We need to live our lives in that period of full wakefulness, because life is too short to be sleepwalking through it. But there's a lot of sleepwalking going on. And we need to just wake people up and wake ourselves up to the reality of what's happening to the world around us, that what we're doing to the earth, we need to be awake to that. And being in the wild and being in a place where there are apex predators like grizzly bears and mountain lion, or if you're in the Arctic, polar bears, or what have you, or saltwater crocodiles if you're in Australia. I mean, these are predators, apex predators, and they'll do you in, but they'll wake you up in the process. So I would rather not be in that moment to finally realize, oh, this is what I should have been doing, and then I'm gone. I'd rather just do it right now. And that's the value for me of being in the mountains, or being in the desert, or being, as I was in the Peace Corps, being in the rainforest, is allowing your own mind to drift away until it makes contact with something that's much greater, and you become absorbed by it and become it. And then there's no separation. That's what indigenous people have. They don't have that separation between the I and the we and what is around them. They are all part of and expressions of the same spirit. So I get carried away when I talk about this stuff. So if I'm boring any of you, I can stop. But it's just that I just want to communicate to you who I am. I grew up thinking of myself as a Black man, a Black kid in Detroit. But now I think of myself as a Black Indian. But I also, more than anything, I think of myself as a human being who's really trying to be Homo sapiens. I was really trying to be a wise person. I think that there's a greater value in wisdom than intelligence. Intelligence is overrated. Intelligence created the atomic bomb, the machine gun, all this other stuff. But wisdom creates this spiritual bridge to something much greater than ourselves and our own existence in this world. And I think that we have a shortage of wisdom and too much intelligence, if you will, that's guiding us. And we need to have a balance between the two. Otherwise, that just leads to therapy, if you're lucky enough to make it to therapy. And so that's kind of how I look at things. And that's why I place such a great value on what you folks are doing in your profession as wilderness advocates. But I would also caution you to deepen that connection beyond the word wilderness. Wilderness, because my background is literature. One thing that I've learned about wilderness, that there is a deer literally hiding in the word for wilderness. It's like wildeor or something like that, but there's a deer. So in other words, they had to put an animal into the meaning, the etymology of the word wilderness, but there's a deer hiding in the word wilderness. So there's an animal, and that which is animal within us that's hiding in ourselves that we rarely let out. So I would just say, release that part of us that is still ancestrally tied to the earth, and then we'll be okay. And restore that sense of the sacred to the earth, because it's not like it's gone, it's always there, but we have to see it and hear it, feel it, and become it. And that's what we need to teach our kids. And so I would say that what's important for me about what you're doing, when you reintroduce people into the wild, don't just have it be circumscribed by what you understand based on the tradition of wilderness as it exists in our culture, meaning the Wilderness Act and so forth. I mean, the Wilderness Act is great because it's protected amazing places, but find something more human or humane and deeper that goes beyond just the terminology. I mean, a place where people can actually feel the truth is better than a place where people can hear the truth. I think it's important for people to come to their own recognition of that which is around them, and that needs no guide. and needs no further translation. It is a direct communication between the world as we know it and the world that we don't know, that does not know us. But I think it does. I think the earth knows everything and everyone and every creature that inhabits it. So anyway, that's really what I wanted to communicate more than anything else. I just wanted to talk to you in a way that I think will be understood. It's important for people to hear the words that you mean to say and how you meant to say them, and that inflection communicates something that's deeper than your conscious thought. So I don't know what else to say, but thanks for listening. But I'm here to answer any of your questions, but the best questions are never answered.
Yeah, I Ranger Johnson, I just gave you all the ability to unmute yourself if you'd like to do whatever you want to, snap or clap or give your love to Ranger Shelton. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, it's not about me. It's about something much greater, but if you're bound to that, that's true greatness. True greatness does not come from within. True greatness comes from a connection with something that is greater than yourself. And when you hear certain people talking and that's coming through, it's not from them, it's through them. When Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and he gave that I have a dream speech, the part that people really remember was not the part that he had memorized. It was the part that he extemporized, because then he was speaking and he was tied to something that was greater than himself. And he became the mouthpiece for the ancestors who were speaking to him, who the spirit that was speaking to him. And so that's what I kind of find, is that don't get in the way of the creator. Let the creator flow through you like electricity in a wire. I'm not the electricity. I'm just the wire. Is a better way of thinking about it. And I think it's just a better, healthier way to go through the world and not laying claim to something that you're not. I'm just a guy who grew up in Detroit, who fell in love with the mountains. But what I realized in the mountains is that there is something great that is there, that is around us. And we are only able to glimpse a part of it. What is that? What was that? I'm trying to remember. There was that analogy of if you were an elephant and if it was an ant, and you asked the ant, what is the elephant? And all it could feel was the feet. You asked a bird, was an elephant, all I could feel was the head. I mean, it's like there's something that's so big, we're only seeing aspects. We're only seeing a fraction of what's actually there. But that fraction hints at something greater, at something that is a whole that we need to be. And that's what happens when you're in the wild. You just get that sense that you're seeing a fraction of something that's much more grand than we have the ability as primates to even comprehend. And it's a cool thing. Yeah.
It definitely is. Ranger Johnson, we are obviously so grateful for you being the wire, as it were, or as someone else mentioned, Michelle McCarthy, helping us with the shovel to unbury the wire and the electricity going through it. So we are going to, I mentioned this in the chat, but everyone, we are needing to forego our Q&A session just in order to respect the next speakers that are coming in. But I hope that our paths get to cross with you again, Ranger Shelton. I think you have given everyone just some amazing little pieces to think about and reflect on in our relationship with the outside and also our students. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Oh goodness. All right, everyone. I am going to release you to your next sessions. And don't worry, we won't be having a secret little Q&A session with Ranger Shelton. Don't worry. But I'll release you to your next sessions. And I hope that this is a foundation for you to learn what you can in the rest of the conference here, and we'll see you again later. everyone. And Shelton, if you have access to the chat, I hope you're getting some of this. Thank you so